The Fujifilm X-T4 has been one of my favorite and most used cameras over the past 2 years. For me, it was the perfect balance between a photography and video camera in a small lightweight package, all for a pretty affordable price. Fuji has now released its successor, the X-T5. So this video is an initial hands-on with the X-T5. I picked it up about 2 weeks ago and have been using it mostly for street photography and some video. Size and portability were a huge factor for me when I initially moved over to Fujifilm, and it seems like they've gone back to their roots with the X-T5. This camera is both lighter and smaller than the X-T4. This is pretty unheard of with modern cameras, which seemingly get heavier and larger with each iteration. Overall, the X-T5 feels more refined and is actually easier to hold with its deeper hand grip compared to the X-T4. This camera feels robust in the hand with its magnesium shell and waterproof construction. The striking retro design remains with the ISO and shutter speed dials at the top, which give the user direct access to many key functions. The button layout on this camera will look familiar as it remains largely unchanged since the X-T4. This includes the focus mode switch on the front and the joystick on the back. One of the improvements over the X-T4 is how customizable all of these buttons are now. You can set custom profiles much like on the X-H2 and X-H2s and assign them to buttons, which means you can set up and customize this camera to exactly suit your needs. So normally with Fujifilm, I'm shooting in semi-auto. I let the camera handle the shutter speed and ISO within the parameters I set, and I manually control the aperture. But if I come across a situation where I need to change my settings, for example, if I want to capture some motion blur, I don't have to go through any menu system. I just drop the shutter speed using the dials at the top. And that's one of the things I love most about Fujifilm X series cameras. Once I'm set up, I never go into any menus. I just pick the camera up and shoot without having to focus on anything other than taking photos or recording video. Photography first was the line Fujifilm used while announcing the X-T5, and this can be seen with the return of the 3-axis screen. This is a change I welcome. I do prefer the 3-axis screen, both for street photography as it makes shooting from the hip easier, and for video too. Despite the renewed focus on photography, the X-T5 strikes a great balance between a photography camera while still being highly capable in the video department. With the X-T5, you can still switch into video mode at the flick of a switch, and combined with the movie optimized control setting, you can both take photos and record video without having to change your settings each time you switch modes. Fujifilm have also included their new F-Log2 profile, which is capable of recording over 13 stops of dynamic range. Furthermore, you can record up to 6K 30 frames a second, 4K in high quality mode with oversampling, and you also have the option of capturing 12-bit RAW to an external recorder. In my opinion, if you are looking for a video focused camera for professional work, or you're looking to film short movies and stuff like that, then the X-H2s may actually be the better option. However, for most use cases, the X-T5 will have you covered with the added bonus of being lighter and smaller than the X-H2s. Compared to the X-H2s, it's a very different shooting experience. The X-H2s is large, it kind of feels like carrying a GFX or shooting with a full frame camera. Whereas with the X-T5, it is much smaller, much lighter. I feel a lot more versatile. I feel like this camera is far less noticeable when I'm doing street photography. And when it comes to photography, I much prefer using the X-T5 compared to any of the X-H cameras. Now there are a couple of features on the X-H2s which do make it worth it if you are primarily into video. But for most use cases, I do feel like the X-T5 has me covered. And the video features on X-T5 are more than good enough for my needs. Now I mostly use this camera for street photography, and when I'm out doing photography, I also like recording scenes. So being able to switch quickly into video mode without having to change settings is really important for me, and I can do that with the X-T5. Secondly, with it being so light and small, it's much easier to travel around with. Now when you're traveling, or if you're walking around for hours and hours a day, every gram in your hand or in your bag makes a difference. So having a lightweight camera which can do both your video and your photography is a major bonus, and it's one of the reasons I love Fujifilm's X-T range. And I feel like with the X-T5, again, they've gone in the right direction by making some incremental improvements while making the overall body lighter and smaller. So when comparing this camera to the X-H2 and X-H2s, there are a couple of drawbacks. Firstly, there's no CF Express slots, so we're stuck with the two SD cards. Now these cards are slow compared to CF Express, and you do feel it when you're out shooting. So if you shoot in burst mode and then you switch over to video, the camera takes a while to clear the buffer before allowing you to record the video, and it means you can end up missing scenes. Secondly, you'll be unable to record RAW internally. On the X-H2s, you can record raw footage directly onto the CF Express card, whereas on the X-T5, you'll need an external recorder. Another thing I'd like Fujifilm to change is this dial on the left underneath the ISO dial, where it has the different burst modes, HDR, bracket, and panorama mode. Now I can count on my hand the amount of times I've used panorama mode or HDR or any of these other modes. I would have preferred if the photometry settings were there, and things like burst mode you'll be able to access with one of the buttons on the back of the camera. That brings me on to the new sensor and image quality. The X-T5 gets a bump up to 40 megapixels with its new sensor and processor. This helps Fujifilm keep in line with its full frame competition from Sony and Canon. Now more megapixels won't make you a better photographer, it won't help you take better photos, but it does help with cropping, and it will help you create larger prints. Fujifilm also claims the new sensor improves how the camera captures color. However, this is something I'll have to test out over months to come before drawing any conclusions. That aside, there's a new pixel shift mode, and Fujifilm's 16 film simulations are all present on the X-T5 as well. So having used this X-T5 for street photography a handful of times, it does feel faster than Fujifilm's older cameras like the X-T4, X-T3 and so on. The autofocusing is noticeably quicker even with this old 35mm f1.4. Next up, the little red box you get around the screen when you record. This is really helpful. The dot that you see on the X-T4 can sometimes be hard to see if you're shooting from a low down angle, so I'm happy Fujifilm made a change there. That aside, it's a pretty familiar experience if you've used the X-T4 or X-T3. There's also incremental improvements. The shutter feels nicer, it's a bit quieter, all the buttons are nicer to press, I prefer the new screen, and yeah, overall it's just a bit snappier, and again, when you're shooting, the autofocusing is both faster and more accurate. Photography first is how Fujifilm announced the X-T5, but thankfully, video is a close second. I do believe this camera is a worthy upgrade to the X-T4, and going forward, I'll be using the X-T5 as my primary camera both for photography and video.